Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Toffee TV USA. I am your co-host, James Boyman, with my good friend and other co-host, Ryan Williams. Today, we're going to be talking about a polarizing topic at the moment in the Everton fan base, and that is the bench left back, Lucas Digne. There's been a lot made of Rafa's decision to sideline one of our previously considered star players, and some of the narratives that have been going around that he's out of form, that he's a bang average left back in the Premier League. We're going to try to provide some objective numbers, as we tend to do over here at the American Toffee podcast, and see if that really holds up to scrutiny and whether or not it's really true. We'll also then talk about what could be next. Could the move make sense for Everton, for the player, et cetera, et cetera. But we will try to look at it with a data focus, and we're going to start with looking at trying to understand, and this is something Ryan talks about very often and something we talk about often on the show, why we use data in the first place and why it's important to use it in conjunction with the proverbial eye test, which we hear a lot about.
Yeah, there's always this conflict for some reason between the eye test to some people and the stats test, for lack of a better term. All data does is provide you different information, more information, and that's all it is. It's useful. So number one, in terms of conflict, there usually isn't a conflict. Normally what you're observing is reflected in the stats, and the stats represent actual events that people are either tracking or that are derived from full motion video stuff where you're just lifting data off the screen. But I think one misnomer is no analyst out there that works in data would ever tell you that the numbers are it. It never tells the whole story, and we all know that. So this idea that, oh, you only make your opinions informed by stats, I don't know who you're talking about, because truly no analyst that works with numbers, they all know the limitation of it. So that's a misnomer from the get-go. I think sometimes when people see stats or they see a number and it seems to conflict with what they believe, sometimes it's just a matter of using the wrong stats. Because people say, well, the stats aren't good. That's a bad stat. Stats are bad. They don't tell you the real story. Well, which stats are you talking about? So if all you're using are goals and assists is a terrible stat, I might add, because it's contingent upon someone else finishing a ball. You could tap it to someone and they knock it in from 40 yards and assist. It really doesn't really get to the heart of what you're trying to measure. Sometimes that's not relevant. Like in Lucas Digne's case, we wouldn't measure him by goals. He very rarely is an opportunity to score, let alone taking shots. That's just not a useful measure for that type of player. So I think that's a misnomer. A lot of people are like, well, look at his numbers. He doesn't show any output. Well, you're using maybe not the best stats to measure output, but at least you're acknowledging the stats provide some sort of objective reality. So that's the whole point. Stats don't ever tell the whole story. No analyst thinks that. So you're not arguing with anyone by saying that. But if you're willing to use stats, I think it's important to pick and choose and understand the ones that measure stuff that's more appropriate for the position. Now, there's also bias, right, James? I mean, that's a big part of sometimes maybe it's just lack of analytical thought process behind it, but certainly bias plays a role in everything. Even the best analyst has some.
Yeah, everyone has bias, and I think it's kind of hard for maybe people to realize, but there's like 24 different kinds of biases that people can hold. And it's really important to avoid those biases and be aware of them when you're trying to analyze any type of information, whether it's football related, life related, it can be anything. One of the big ones is confirmation bias, where you have your opinion, and so you selectively choose points that back up what you already think and ignore the ones that might contradict what you think. And there, again, there's dozens, but one big thing is recency bias, or a bias towards forgetting the past and only going off the most recent information. And then another one that people are subject to, I think, when they're watching a football match is the big events, right? You remember the big impactful events, such as, in Lucas Digne's case, getting burned by Max Aarons in the Norwich game, or getting burned by Jordan Henderson in the Derby. You remember those things and they stick clearly in your mind. And so you think you use those moments to form a larger opinion about the player. And in doing so, you forget maybe the half dozen times Lucas Digne stuffed Mo Salah in the derby, or the number of times he bottled a player. And you just, in the course of watching a match, you're not watching one player through the whole thing. And that's where I think there's some flaws to the eye test. And again, we're not saying...
And those can all get mixed in together, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes confirmation bias is a real dangerous one. But you mix them all together, you're going to have some. So it's important to kind of recognize those things as well. I think another thing, though, too, is the eye test. A lot of people don't realize the eye test doesn't tell you everything either, does it?
No, the eye test is, of course, we're all watching the match. We want to enjoy watching the match. No one is going to say, don't watch the match and just go look at numbers and expect to get a realistic picture of what happened.
Right.
That's how traditionally the game has been consumed, but it doesn't tell the whole story, because in order to really get a full picture of, to answer a question such as, is Lucas Digne a good left back? You would have to watch just Lucas Digne in every match for the full time he's on the pitch and make note of every single action that he makes while he's playing. Is he getting up and down? Most people aren't doing that. I'm certainly not doing it when I'm watching the match live. I'm watching the ball a lot of the time, or I'm watching the movement of the entire defensive back line. I'm not just watching one player, because that's just a bizarre way to consume football. And it's not always that entertaining.
It's not that bizarre. Who we call him?
It's not what the average person does.
True.
Let's put it that way.
Of course.
And the other thing you would have to do, if you're looking at, is Lucas Digne a good player, is you would have to then watch not only all his matches, but every other match by every other left back in the Premier League, and figure out some way to compare those by some measure. You could use the eye test, but again, by the time you're on the third or fourth match of watching, João Cancelo, you're going to forget half of the actions that Lucas Digne made in the third match of the season. So it's impossible for people to retain all of that information, and oftentimes even to consume it all. And so that's why we use stats, because they measure these things for us to support things that we can observe when we're actually watching live.
Yeah, it's just more information that helps. It helps give you the context sometimes, and sometimes you can see what you think you observe. And if it's ratified with the stats, normally you're like, yeah, I feel pretty good about things. Yeah. The one thing, too, that I get all the time is, watch the games. Football's not played on a spreadsheet. That's the one that I have to admit irks me a little bit, because it's an insult. I mean, we're not Neanderthals now. I believe we've evolved to the point in, as human beings, our race is capable of watching a game. And in my case, I recognize I'm not normal, but I tend to watch the matches 2 or 3 times at least.
You are not.
And take lots of notes and all sorts of things like that. But then I'll go and look at the data. It takes me 5-10 minutes to look at the data. It takes me a lot longer to watch the matches. So there's nothing, I'm not incapable as a human of using my eyes. And it's just this kind of a silly idea. Like, I would just do both. Like, there's nothing prohibiting me from doing that as a human being. So that one irks me a little bit, I have to admit. So, but that's a silly argument. I mean, so anyway, that's the point. Maybe that was unnecessary to go in the background, but we thought it was important that we're going to try, and we always try to do this on the American Toffee podcast, to be objective. And look, we all have feelings. We're all passionate. I get it. So, all right, let's apply some of those standards, and, viewers, keep us honest, and listeners, please, as many of you normally do. And let's talk first about Lucas Digne's performance this year. We'll get to next year in a second. Let's just talk about this year. In particular, it seems some people really still don't believe that he's definitely in a different role.
Yeah, and this is something we've covered extensively on the American Toffee podcast, but it's been covered also by others. Adam Jones from the Liverpool Echo came out with an article in November quoting Lucas Digne himself, where he said, "The manager asked me to be more of a defender this season, to stay back a bit more and keep a better balance for the team. Then, sometimes I can drive forwards, but only when it's right for the team. My first job is to defend. I am a left back. If the manager asked me to defend 99% of the time, I would defend 99% of the time." So he goes on to say, this is for the good of the team, et cetera, et cetera. But being predominantly a defensive player is not how Lucas Digne has always been used since he's been in an Everton shirt. People will remember, or should remember quite well, how critical he was to our offense when he first arrived. His ability to get forward, his ability to cross, his ability to be dangerous in the final third, his passing ability, all these things, which we'll talk about coming up. But it's certainly a much, much different role for Digne, being asked to defend, and there's a reason for that, and it has to do with the larger tactical plan that Rafa Benitez has implemented at Everton.
And I think it's probably not the wisest thing in the world to attack more in the right through Coleman or Townsend or whoever else is out there rather than Dean. And I think that's a very logical assumption. And I think Dean's probably a little ticked about it. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense to him. But it's true. If you think about it, too, it's almost worse. It's one thing for him to defend more just by the nature of the role and the tactics. Look at the players around him. I mean, typically we're setting up, especially when Gray's off to the left, they're pretty much in a free roll. So if they're kind of free, that gets him more exposed. I think Alon this year has been downright reckless, and Rafael Benitez is convinced he's more of the sitting midfielder as opposed to Decore's, who's getting up the pitch more. And he's been reckless and leaving the back line very much exposed. You constantly call it the gap, the space we're leaving between the back lines. And Dean is having to deal with that. Another reason why is Michael Keane is not that comfortable stepping up as a center half. So all of these things in conjunction leave Lucas Digne on an island very often. So it's not just the role, it's also the players around him. And I think it's very obvious this is happening through the eye test, but the stats also give you a little bit of feedback too. So if you just look at them, some of these things are definitely going to affect the way he attacks going forward. So number one, he was taken off set pieces in week 4 in corners, which I think was a slap in the face, and I'm sure he took it that way. It's not like he's replaced Thomas Rodriguez here, as we said in the first half. So, yeah, I'm probably a little ticked about that if I am him. But look, he's only taken 2 corners since week 4. So that's going to affect naturally your overarching production if you're not savvy enough to say, oh, well, he's getting a lot of open play chances versus set piece chances because you get to pick and choose who takes them. Beyond that, too, just look at his touches. I mean, I think he's only had more than 1 or 0 touches in the penalty area in only 2 games this year. Last year in 30 games he played, he did that in 13. So they're way down. He's at like 1.3 last year to 1.15. His touches in the attacking third down are down by a couple as well. So I think it's very obvious, and you look at the numbers, that he's not attacking as often, and it's tactical. And I think also people remember last year, this is maybe a bit of a recency bias, he didn't get into the box a single time in the last 5 matches because Carlo was being very pragmatic. And I think that was totally reasonable. So I think sometimes people are forgetting about that. But, okay, this stuff is affecting the offensive production. We know it's down because of his role. But then, okay, he's defending more. So one thing I've heard a lot of people say out, especially in social media, is this claim that Lucas Digne is a poor defender.
Yeah, I've seen it plenty. I mean, people have said he's a bang average defender. He gets beaten constantly, one-on-one versus the dribble. He's a shell of his former self, what he was when he first arrived. A lot of these statements that, frankly, I haven't really noticed watching the matches. Yes, I remember the moments, like I mentioned earlier, when he got rinsed by Max Aarons or he got beat once or twice in a match, and maybe those led to goals, and that's important to remember, and those were pivotal moments in matches. But I don't remember every duel Lucas Digne has been in this season, and I certainly don't remember the percentage that he's won, which is why it's so important that we measure these things and we have people who closely analyze the data, keep track of all of that, and then you can get a better picture.
Well, because it's also relative to the other people in the position. So right. I sent out a series of tweets a week or so ago to try and put things in perspective, because I'm observing nothing about him that makes him a bad defensive left back. In fact, I think it's crazy. It's a testament to his ability that he can attack the way he could and yet actually play in a role like he is right now, especially considering the people around him. So first tweet said of left backs in the Premier League with over 450 minutes, and again, this is a week ago, Dean's averaging 11.85 successful defensive actions with a 66% duel win rate. All right. So defensive duels are tackles, any sort of engagement whatsoever. And I wrote, guess how many other players can say that? The answer? 0. And the point I'm trying to make is, again, there's context behind that, but that's not insignificant. It says something, I think. But again, there is context, right, James?
Yeah, of course there's context, but it shows you that guys who are playing left back in those 2 metrics, defensive actions, he's winning a bunch. Almost 12 a match.
Yeah.
Or 12 per 90, I should say. And a 66% dual win rate. And that is far and away much higher than anyone else in the Premier League in his peer group. So to say he's a poor defender, well, if you believe that, then you also have to believe that almost everyone else is worse than him.
I mean, certainly in that metric, but it's not just that metric, and that was the point I was trying to make. So let's tack on to it. Next tweet. Top 20 in the Premier League in interceptions. Top 5 in tackles won in the final third. And he's already, and his aerial numbers have always been outstanding. No one's obviously ever going to say he's bad in the air as a left back. He's one of the best in the league. So even beyond that, so the idea that he's being beat on the dribble a ton, I've seen that. I mean, that's a stat and a metric that people specifically track. He's third in the Premier League in tackles versus the dribbles. And so you're thinking, well, yeah, he's just having a lot of tackles because he's being attacked. Well, he's fifth in win percentage. So what are you talking about? So the numbers indicate not only is he not a bad defender, he's one of the best defenders in the league, is what the numbers say. Now, again, there's context, but this is comparing him to everyone in the league, some of these numbers. So if it'd be one thing if it was just a volume-based metric, but the rates are no joke. And they've always been pretty solid. They're just up a little bit this year. So the numbers certainly indicate he's a very good defensive left back. So look, I don't observe anything different. He does make mistakes like everyone else does, but if you watch a lot of football, I mean, it's tough to defend 1v1, especially against the players in the Premier League. And, for me, I'm not seeing it, and I think the numbers support it as well. So okay, that's this year. All right, different role. Production is outrageous. Let's talk about last year, because I feel like there's been some feedback from some other people that he had a good first half and a poor second half.
Yeah, there's this weird thing that's happened where the narrative started, I think, right around when the falling out with Rafa began, that he's been out of form this season and that's why he's been benched, he's been bang average, all this sort of stuff. And somehow now people are saying he's been poor for the better part of 2 seasons, and I honestly don't know where that came from, because we've been, at one point we had to check ourselves on the American Toffee podcast, because we rarely talked about how good Lucas Digne consistently was, just because he had set the standard so high for himself that even when he was a little below that, he was still very, very good.
It's a running joke. It was like a running joke on the pod.
Right. So I'm not having anyone say that he's been poor for two plus years, even some saying 3+ years, which is just lunacy to me. I won't have it, and I don't think there's anyone that can provide any evidence other than naming individual plays that don't really mean anything when you add context to them that support that opinion, frankly.
Yeah, so let's take a step back and say, okay, maybe some of the people saying this are not completely insane. There must be some reason why they think that, all right? And I think they're wrong, and we could say that they're wrong, and that's fine, but being the American Toffee podcast as we are, taking a step back is there's some reasons. And I have to admit, there are some indicators that if you were kind of lazy, and this goes back to some of the bias, focusing on certain types of stats or recency bias, that might indicate someone thinks that he had a better first half.
Yeah, so if you break it out, he played 30 matches for us last season. You break it out straight down the middle, first 15 versus second 15. The first thing that will stick out is that in the first 15 matches he played, he had 6 assists. In the second 15, he only had 1. So someone would look at that and, without looking any deeper, say, well, he wasn't nearly as creative in the second half as he was in the first, because he had 6 times more assists in the first half. But you dig in a little deeper, you start looking at some of those other numbers, and it turns out that this is a good illustration of why assists isn't great, because you're so dependent on, he could have been firing in just as many creative passes, and it turns out he was. His shot created actions in the second half were much higher. He had 40 versus 30. His expected assists, 2.9 versus 2.4. He had more progressive passes, 58 to 50, a higher XG. So the numbers just start to add up. And again, one of these things in isolation could be just a fluke or something, but altogether, they start to paint a pretty convincing picture.
Yeah, it just goes back again to bias. So we remember big events. I mean, Dominic Calvert-Lewin was on fire last year at the beginning of the year, and he was finishing everything. So that's part of it. And yeah, so you remember the big goals, the assists. And because at the end of the year we started tailing off, people maybe forget about the performance on the first half, or because those big events are happening, maybe people missed them. But that's pretty obvious. I mean, that's why expected assists is just such a better metric, because it measures the quality of the chance and essence you created for the other person, and just shot created actions is a volume stat. And it's very obvious. And it's not like, he had more passes in the first half and we had more of the ball. But yeah, dribbles were way up as well. He had like twice as many attempts in that second half, if we're doing the 15 games for the 15 games, at like 73%. He was dribbling like a maniac because he had to. Because, we were relying on him to try and create more. And so, look, I think he was simply more creative in the second half, and I think the metrics indicate that. And the 6 assists were really just a byproduct of luck. I really think that's all it was. You could say, well, the quality's not there. Well, the numbers seem to say very much something different. And sometimes people associate overall form of a club with the individuals. So, when people are playing not so well around you, it doesn't mean necessarily that Digne is at fault. It could be other people as well. But again, it's a fluid game. I get that. We're just saying, objectively speaking, the numbers don't tell that picture at all. He was every bit as creative in the second half. So let's talk about defense a little bit. So look, his volume was higher in the second half, for sure. Tackles won were the same, just using some basic numbers. Interceptions were twice as high, 17 versus 9. He had way more clearances, 55 to 37. That's probably just because he's defending more. So let's ignore volume numbers. Tackle rates, much higher, 69% versus 53%. Pressure rates slightly less, but it's like 25.2 versus 26.2. So the point is, there's certainly no statistical evidence on the defensive side that he was worse, because it'd be one thing if you saw higher volume and a lower win rate. And probably What was happening is, it's the same Lucas Digne. He was just up in the pitch more and making tackles higher in the pitch, and I think that was true. And those are normally a lower win rate and a lower percentage. So anyway, all I'm saying is, we look at those numbers, and is there anything objective that we can look at, James, that would indicate his form has dropped at all from the first half to the second half?
Not that I can really see.
And I think that's subjective. We're trying to be objective here, and I think we're successful in doing that.
I like Lucas Digne as a player, but I'm also not, dug in on this idea that he's been great. I just want to try to formulate an opinion with as much information as I can possibly get, and the numbers tell me he's been quite good. If they said otherwise, we're not trying to fit these numbers into this neat little box to fit a narrative. It's just taking them for what they're worth, and this is what they say. So you can believe it, you cannot believe it, you can trust the eye test, but we've been over why you may be there may be some blind spots when you try to do that. And then you look at, okay, so we're in this riff with Rafa where he's been benched and he's supposedly sick, and he may have faked sick. We don't know. He hasn't really said anything. We talked about it. But if he were to go, if he was truly out of form and playing poorly, just signed a new contract, would all of these quite good and wealthy clubs looking to compete for trophies and win the Champions League and do all these sorts of things, would these be the type of clubs that you would think would want to come in for him? Because we know there's a lot of players who have underperformed in an Everton shirt, and we've had some real problems over the last 3 or 4 seasons getting rid of those guys. Lucas Digne doesn't seem like the type of player who would be difficult to move. In fact, it seems like he'd be pretty easy to move. The question becomes, what type of fee do you get for him? And what's the plan when you try to replace one of your best players moving forward? But we talked about it a little bit, Ryan. In theory, moving on one of your best players for a big fee, who's now 28, could make sense, because that's sort of the direction that Everton need to go strategically to be run sustainably, right?
Yeah, I think that's a wise decision in many cases. I think the circumstance around it is not ideal. I don't think this is maybe the right time. And those are things that we're going to explore in future episode on Toffee, on the American Toffee podcast, and perhaps on Toffee TV as well. But yeah, look, Man City, Chelsea, if these teams were interested in him, obviously he's okay. And most people at that age, maybe, he wouldn't be quite as attractive due to that age, but he's just simply that outstanding. And his versatility is something that teams would want. He can fit in a lot of different styles. That's another indicator. Some of these teams play in different ways, and they still want him. But yeah, the bottom line is we took an objective view. My eye test tells me he looks like the same darn player. And just in general, really, would it make that much sense where someone has been that elite a player for so long at age 28 that he's suddenly lost a lot. I mean, yes, I agree that might be slightly on the down end for certain players, but not for good players and not for elite players. Normally, they're able to sustain their form much longer. And like you said, these teams wouldn't be after him if they didn't think that. So look, this is our take. You can agree, disagree, love to get feedback and opinions. But in our eyes, I think both of us agree that the eye test, the numbers, it all seems to sync up for me that Lucas Digne is every bit the player as he was last year, the year before, as far as we can tell. And hopefully these guys can get things ironed out. And if he's got to go, he's got to go. But we'll do some further analysis on that scenario, how much we think we could get for him, and his replacement on future episodes of the American Toffee podcast.
Yeah, and again, if you disagree, if you want to sound off in the comments, absolutely let us know. You can reach out to us on Twitter. You can find all of our social media links at linktr.ee/USA Toffee Pod, which will be in the description. You can send us an email at americantoffee@gmail.com. Let us know what you think. We appreciate the feedback. We appreciate the back and forth very much. If you want to join our Discord, you can also do that. It's a great community. We've got a lot of people in there who have a very well-reasoned, and we have some very thoughtful and intelligent conversations about Everton. You can find that at invite.gg/ATP. Otherwise, we thank you very much for listening and watching. We hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, up the Toffees.